In the murky depths of history, there exists a chilling theory, one that blurs the line between medicine and mysticism. Imagine a world where a deformity, a birth defect, could be seen not as an anomaly or a flaw, but as a harbinger of the future, a sign from a higher power, a divine message encoded in the human body. What if the very physical characteristics of a person, formed before birth, carried a deeper meaning that only a select few could decipher? Such was the belief of one physician, who, in the heart of 18th century Naples, meticulously catalogued deformities not as mere biological accidents, but as signs of fate, portents that foretold significant events in history. This is not the story of a man who simply studied the human body. This is the tale of a physician who, by examining twisted limbs, malformed faces, and unusual growths, believed he could glimpse the very future. In Naples, a city where the Enlightenment met old-world superstition, one doctor's work would come to symbolize the tension between reason and irrationality, science and faith. His name was Giovanni Maria Lancisi, and his obsession with deformities would lead him down a path so strange and macabre that it would leave an indelible mark on the history of medicine. Lancisi was not alone in his intrigue. His time was marked by an intense fascination with the human form, not just as a biological structure, but as a reflection of something much grander, a reflection of destiny, the divine, and the unknown. It was an era where the body was a canvas upon which the mysteries of life were painted, and the divine was often ascribed to things that defied explanation. Deformities, as odd and unnatural as they may seem to us now, were not simply seen as defects in the body's design. They were puzzles, enigmatic, perplexing, and, to some, prophetic. The concept of deformities as signs of something larger than the individual has ancient roots, often entwined with religion, mythology, and folklore. Throughout history, many societies have interpreted abnormal births as omens, often associated with divine displeasure or cosmic punishment. In medieval Europe, for instance, children born with physical abnormalities were sometimes seen as witches or marked by the devil. They were either hidden away or, worse, subjected to cruel treatment, as people believed they had been chosen to bear the curse of prophecy. This blend of superstition and medical curiosity continued well into the 17th and 18th centuries, when medical professionals, under the influence of both classical thought and emerging scientific ideas, began to document these anomalies in greater detail. The line between natural phenomena and supernatural explanations was often blurred. This backdrop of superstition and growing scientific inquiry set the stage for Lancisi's work. He was a man of the Enlightenment, a period defined by the rise of reason and scientific investigation. Yet, like many in his time, he could not entirely free himself from the beliefs of the past. The notion that the human body was not just a biological machine, but a vessel for deeper meanings, was something that still haunted the medical community. Lancisi's observations and recordings of deformities were not motivated solely by a desire to understand disease or anatomy. His interest went beyond the material to the metaphysical. He believed that the body could communicate something greater, something that transcended science. He didn't just see malformed limbs and twisted spines as medical curiosities. He saw them as omens, as cryptic messages from the cosmos about the fate of nations, the course of wars, and the future of mankind itself. At the core of Lancisi's theories was the idea that deformities were not random. In his eyes, they were a divine handwriting, a form of prophecy written in flesh. A child born with a cleft palate, a twisted arm, or a misshapen skull was not just a biological anomaly. According to Lancisi, these deformities could signal the impending arrival of an earthquake, a plague, or a political upheaval. The twisted forms of these children, in his mind, were like omens in the sky, signaling that the fates had already been sealed. These deformities weren't just biological accidents, they were the messages of destiny. And Lancisi, a physician deeply entrenched in both the sciences and the superstitions of his time, believed it was his duty to decode them. His fascination with deformities as prophesied was deeply tied to the intellectual environment in which he lived. The 18th century was a time when medical science was rapidly advancing, but it was still steeped in superstition. Lancisi was well versed in the anatomical knowledge of his day, but he also held onto a belief system that saw meaning in the mysterious. He was influenced by the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, who were beginning to unravel the mysteries of the human body, but he was also surrounded by a culture that still believed in omens, supernatural signs, and the hand of God in the affairs of man. In many ways, Lancisi's work was a product of this tension between the rational and the irrational, the scientific and the mystical. He was a man who believed that, just as a physician could read the signs of a disease within the body, they could also read the signs of fate. And what he saw in these deformities, far beyond their physical deformity, was a glimpse into the future. The strange marriage between medical observation and mystical interpretation that Lancisi embodied was not unique to him. It was a reflection of a time when humanity was caught between two worlds, one rapidly advancing through the corridors of science, and the other deeply rooted in the ancient beliefs that had shaped human understanding for centuries. In this sense, Lancisi's work represents a moment where the old ways of thinking about the human body and the supernatural collided with the burgeoning world of modern science. To some, his work may have seemed revolutionary, an early attempt at understanding genetic anomalies and their significance. To others, it was a dangerous flirtation with superstition, a dangerous path that threatened to derail the progress of medicine. As we begin to peel back the layers of Lancisi's beliefs and work, it becomes clear that the physician was not just a man fascinated with deformities. He was a man who saw these physical anomalies as symbols of something greater, something hidden beneath the surface of human existence. To him, each deformity was like a riddle, a puzzle that held the key to understanding the future. He was trying to unlock the code of fate, and the human body, in his view, was the key. The mysteries that lay within these twisted limbs and malformed faces were not just medical problems to be solved, they were messages that could reveal the course of human history. For those in Lancisi's time, deformities were not just physical flaws. They were events in the making, each one a potential marker of a disaster or a transformation on the horizon. And as Lancisi examined these anomalies, he was not just cataloguing them, he was witnessing the unfolding of a prophecy. The deeper we go into his story, the more it becomes clear that Lancisi's work was not just about deformities. It was about the intersection of medicine, mythology, and fate. He was a man driven by a profound belief that the human body held more than just biological secrets. It held the answers to questions about destiny and fate, questions that no one could yet answer but everyone feared to ask. As we explore the haunting legacy of Dr. Naples was a bustling metropolis, one of the most important cities in the Kingdom of Naples, and a major center of trade and politics in southern Italy. Its streets were alive with the noise of commerce, the clattering of horse-drawn carts, and the lively chatter of locals. The city was home to grand palaces and churches, yet beneath the surface, it was a place where the influence of religion and superstition remained unshaken by the scientific advancements sweeping through Europe. The people of Naples, like many in the 18th century, held fast to the belief that the forces of nature and the divine were intricately linked, and that human lives were shaped by powerful, often invisible, forces. The medical landscape of Naples, however, was beginning to change. By the time Giovanni Maria Lancisi began his work on deformities in the mid-1700s, the world of medicine was at a crossroads. The ideas of the Renaissance, with their emphasis on human anatomy and the study of the body, had paved the way for a more systematic and scientific approach to understanding health. The early 18th century saw the rise of great anatomists and physicians, such as Giovanni Battista Morgagni, who sought to uncover the hidden truths of the human body. Dissection and autopsies were becoming more common, and the study of disease was starting to shift toward a more empirical, evidence-based approach. Yet, despite these advances, the boundaries of science were still ill-defined. The scientific method, though gaining traction, was far from universally accepted. Many people still believed that the human body was not just a biological system, but a spiritual vessel, and that the forces of nature, the divine, and the supernatural played a significant role in shaping human existence. Medicine, for many, was not simply about diagnosing and treating illness. It was about understanding the soul, the fate of the individual, and the greater forces at play in the universe. For Giovanni Maria Lancisi, this duality of scientific progress and superstition would become a defining characteristic of his work. Lancisi was born in 1654 and grew up during a time when Naples, like much of Italy, was influenced by both the flourishing ideas of the Enlightenment and the strong grip of religious authority. Although educated in the scientific traditions of his time, Lancisi was never fully able to free himself from the pervasive belief that the human body, with all its imperfections and anomalies, might hold clues to deeper, cosmic truths. It was in this environment, a city torn between the rational and the mystical, that Lancisi's interest in deformities as Prophecies took root. At the time, Naples was also experiencing a period of great social and political upheaval. The Kingdom of Naples was ruled by the Spanish Habsburgs, but by the mid-1700s, political power was in flux, and there was a growing tension between the traditional monarchy and the rising influence of the Enlightenment thinkers. Naples was a city filled with both hope and fear, a place where revolutionary ideas about liberty and the nature of power were beginning to spread, even as the fear of divine retribution and supernatural forces lingered in the minds of the people. This tension between the old and the new was mirrored in the field of medicine. Physicians like Lancisi were not just concerned with diagnosing and curing diseases, they were also grappling with the question of what the human body truly represented. Was it a mere collection of organs and systems, a machine to be dissected and understood? Or was it a divine vessel, a medium through which the forces of fate, the supernatural, and the divine could communicate with mankind? For Lancisi, deformities were not just signs of illness or medical anomalies. They were symbolic, charged with meaning beyond the physical. In the city of Naples, where the presence of the church was undeniable and the power of religious dogma still held sway over much of daily life, the idea of deformities as divine messages or signs was not an entirely foreign concept. Superstition ran deep in the city's streets, where belief in omens, portents, and the supernatural was common. Many people believed that the body was not just a physical entity, but a reflection of the spiritual world, a microcosm of larger cosmic forces. In a city where earthquakes, plagues, and famines were often seen as divine punishment or judgment, it wasn't far-fetched to believe that physical deformities could be a manifestation of something greater. Lancisi's work in Naples occurred at a time when the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and scientific investigation was starting to challenge the medieval worldview. Yet, despite the growing influence of rational thought, there was still a profound attachment to the old ways of thinking, the belief that the human body was not just a scientific puzzle, but a vessel for divine messages. The city itself was caught in this transition, a place where the medieval view of the world, with its deep connection to religion and superstition, rubbed up against the rising tide of scientific inquiry and empirical study. It was within this world that Lancisi began his cataloguing of deformities. He wasn't the first to study the human body in such detail, nor was he the first to document physical anomalies. However, his approach was unique in that he did not view deformities as random occurrences or merely as medical curiosities. To him, each deformity was a clue, a message hidden within the body, waiting to be decoded. He believed that the human body was a book written by divine hands, and that by studying these deformities, he could uncover the secrets of the universe itself. Lancisi's fascination with deformities went beyond the typical medical curiosity of his time. He saw them as symbols, as omens that could predict the future. The people of Naples, who lived in a world where disease, disaster, and death were constant fears, were naturally drawn to such ideas. The thought that deformities could be prophetic, that they could offer a glimpse into the future, offered a sense of order and meaning in a world that often seemed chaotic and beyond human control. For Lancisi, his work was more than a scientific endeavor. It was a way of seeking understanding in an uncertain and unpredictable world. In a city where the body was seen as a reflection of the soul, Lancisi's theory that deformities were prophetic made a kind of eerie sense. The idea that the human body could contain hidden truths about the future was not so far-fetched in a world that still believed in miracles, divine intervention, and the supernatural. Naples, with its rich history of both scientific inquiry and religious devotion, provided the perfect stage for Lancisi's unusual theories to take root. The city's population, steeped in both superstition and emerging scientific thought, would have been particularly receptive to the idea that deformities were not just biological accidents, but signs from a higher power. For those who lived in Naples at the time, this belief offered a sense of meaning and hope in a world fraught with uncertainty. Whether Lancisi's theories were truly a breakthrough in understanding the human body or a dangerous flirtation with superstition, they were deeply rooted in the culture and beliefs of 18th century Naples, a city straddling the line between science and the supernatural, reason and belief. Giovanni Maria Lancisi was a man whose intellectual curiosity and cultural context collided to create a unique and controversial medical legacy. Born in 1654 in the Kingdom of Naples, a region heavily influenced by both the Renaissance's burgeoning scientific discoveries and centuries of deeply ingrained superstition, Lancisi found himself walking a delicate line between the old world and the new. At the time of his birth, Naples was still under the rule of the Spanish Habsburgs, and while it was a hub of art, culture, and intellectual thought, it was also a place where superstition, religion, and a deep belief in the supernatural permeated everyday life. From a young age, Lancisi was exposed to a world where both science and mysticism were equally influential, an environment that would later shape his professional and personal pursuits. Lancisi's educational background placed him at the heart of the scientific revolution that had begun to sweep across Europe. He studied medicine at the University of Naples, where he gained a deep understanding of human anatomy and the medical practices of the time. His education reflected the growing influence of the Enlightenment, a period in which reason, observation, and empirical study were beginning to redefine how people understood the natural world. However, even as the Enlightenment's ideals were making their mark, the deeply religious nature of Naples and its traditions would leave an indelible mark on Lancisa's thinking. Like many educated men of his era, Lancisa believed in the power of reason and scientific method, but he could not escape the broader cultural currents of his time, where religious beliefs about fate, divine intervention, and cosmic order were deeply woven into the fabric of daily life. By the time Lancisa began to practice medicine, the field had made significant advances, particularly in the areas of anatomy and the understanding of disease. Anatomical dissections were becoming more common, and physicians had access to a wealth of new knowledge regarding the human body. But despite these advances, the understanding of medical conditions, particularly those that were inexplicable or hard to categorize, was still rooted in a mixture of scientific observation and supernatural explanation. In the face of these complexities, Lancisa's approach to medicine was characterized by both rational inquiry and an ongoing fascination with the supernatural elements that still pervaded medical thought. It was this blend of scientific observation and mystical interpretation that would define his work, especially as he began his controversial studies of deformities. The first time Lancisa encountered deformities in a way that would shape his future theories, he was struck not just by the physical abnormalities themselves, but by what he saw as their deeper significance. During the 17th and 18th centuries, deformities, especially those observed in children, were often viewed through the lens of religious belief. Physical anomalies, such as congenital malformations, were sometimes considered signs of divine punishment or supernatural influence. To many, they were ominous, signaling that something had gone wrong in the cosmic order. Some believed that such deformities were direct manifestations of God's displeasure, while others thought they could foretell tragic events. Lancisa, with his scientific training, began to approach these abnormalities from a different perspective. He was not simply interested in cataloguing deformities as a way of understanding physical malformations. Rather, he believed that these anomalies were symbols, messages encoded in the body, and that they held deeper meaning, especially if one could interpret them correctly. At the heart of Lancisa's theory was the notion that deformities were not random but instead could serve as a form of prophecy. He saw them as divine signals, omens, or premonitions of significant events. In his mind, the human body was not just a biological entity but a vessel that carried within it messages from a higher power. This belief was rooted in the cultural context of the time, where the human body was often regarded as a reflection of the soul, and where physical abnormalities were often interpreted as outward manifestations of inner turmoil, divine will, or fate. The body, according to Lancisa, was a kind of book, written by divine hands, and deformities were the cryptic symbols that needed to be deciphered. Through his work, Lancisa sought to unlock this book and understand the messages it held about the future of humankind. Lancisa's work was unique in its attempt to systematize and categorize deformities according to their supposed prophetic significance. He didn't simply observe these anomalies in an isolated or anecdotal way. He meticulously documented them, collecting detailed records of the types of deformities he encountered and correlating them with historical events and disasters. His method was deeply influenced by the prevailing medical practices of the time, which emphasized careful documentation and empirical observation. But what set Lancisa apart was his willingness to cross the boundaries between science and mysticism. While other physicians may have seen deformities as curiosities or pathologies to be studied from a strictly medical standpoint, Lancisa was convinced that they were part of a larger cosmic design, a design that could be understood if one could decode the messages hidden in these physical irregularities. He focused particularly on infants born with deformities, an area of medicine that was still relatively underdeveloped. This was a time when many conditions that we now recognize as genetic or congenital disorders were poorly understood. Children born with cleft palates, hydrocephalus, scoliosis, and other deformities were often seen as tragic but not fully understood. Lancisa, however, believed that these children were not simply victims of genetic misfortune or the consequences of disease. Instead, he saw them as bearers of important messages, prophecies that foretold the future. He catalogued these deformities not just as medical curiosities, but as signs that pointed to something greater, something more profound. What's fascinating about Lancisa's work is not just his belief in the prophetic nature of deformities, but his conviction that these physical anomalies were somehow tied to larger events in the world. He believed that the deformities he catalogued were linked to the political, social, and natural events of his time. For example, he believed that children born with certain deformities, such as a disfigured face or twisted limbs, were symbolic of impending natural disasters, political upheavals, or significant societal changes. In his mind, These deformities were not just isolated occurrences, they were part of a grander narrative, a story written by divine forces that only a select few could understand. Lanceise's theories were not widely accepted by the medical community of his time, and many contemporaries dismissed his work as unscientific and overly speculative. This is not surprising, given the context of the time. The 18th century was a period in which medicine was beginning to shift from the humoral and superstitious theories of the past to more modern, scientific approaches. The advent of new tools for studying the human body, such as the microscope, was gradually shifting the focus of medical inquiry toward the tangible and measurable aspects of biology. Yet, even as these scientific advances were being made, the belief in the supernatural was not easily erased. For Lanceise, deformities were not just medical conditions, they were signs of something deeper, something cosmic in nature. Lanceise's work has been criticized for its reliance on superstition and its lack of empirical rigor. In many ways, his cataloguing of deformities was ahead of its time, attempting to create a system that could correlate physical anomalies with broader historical and societal events. His work foreshadowed the later developments in genetics and the study of congenital disorders, but his conclusions were deeply influenced by the cultural and religious milieu in which he lived. Lanceise's belief that deformities were prophesied would be seen by modern scientists as an unfortunate conflation of medical observation and mystical interpretation. However, in the context of 18th century Naples, a city where reason and religion were often inextricably intertwined, his work was not entirely out of place. It reflected the complex and sometimes contradictory nature of the period, where scientific progress was tempered by ancient beliefs and a deep-seated faith in the divine. As we reflect on Lanceise's legacy, it becomes clear that his work represents a fascinating moment in the history of medicine. He was a man caught between two worlds, one advancing toward a rational, scientific understanding of the body, and the other rooted in centuries of religious and superstitious thought. Lanceise's cataloguing of deformities as prophecies is a striking reminder of how the human desire to find meaning in the world often leads to the blending of science, superstition, and religion. Even as medicine made strides toward understanding the biological basis of deformities, Lanceise's work highlights the enduring human need to seek out deeper meanings, to find patterns in the seemingly random, and to see the human body as something more than just flesh and bone. His legacy, though controversial, offers a window into a time when the lines between science and mysticism were far from clear, and reminds us that the history of medicine is not just a story of progress, but also of belief, fear, and the search for meaning in a world full of uncertainty. The moment Giovanni Maria Lanceise began examining deformities as potential prophecies, he was stepping into a realm that straddled both the realm of medicine and the world of mysticism. His theory, which linked physical deformities to the unfolding of future events, wasn't just a scientific observation or a clinical diagnosis. It was a belief system, an intricate web of ideas that married the early modern advances in anatomy with a deep-seated cultural fixation on signs, omens, and divine communication. In the mid-1700s, this was a time when scientific discovery was rapidly advancing, but when the old worldviews that blended religious interpretations of the natural world still held considerable sway. Lanceise's approach was grounded in the Enlightenment's push for knowledge and empirical observation, but it was still heavily influenced by the surrounding cultural atmosphere, a time when faith and reason often coexisted, sometimes uncomfortably. In this context, Lanceise's work on deformities reflected not only his personal scientific curiosity but also his desire to make sense of the world around him. His conclusions were far from mainstream, but they were not entirely out of step with the broader intellectual environment of 18th century Europe, where the natural world was still seen as a tapestry of interconnected mysteries that science had yet to fully unravel. Lanceise did not view deformities merely as medical anomalies. His belief was that the human body could act as a vessel for greater truths, that there was more to these physical irregularities than could be understood through biology alone. His study of deformities was not just about understanding them in the way that a modern physician might attempt to trace their genetic origins or classify them by cause. Instead, he approached them as messages, symbols, and omens, each one a potential harbinger of future events. He viewed the twisted limbs, the disfigured faces, the strange growths, not just as signs of a disease or genetic disorder, but as premonitions of things to come. To Lancise, the human body was a kind of living text, one that could be read and interpreted, and these deformities were the punctuation marks of fate. This idea, that physical abnormalities could serve as prophecies of societal upheaval, political disasters, or even natural catastrophes, was not unique to Lancise, but his systematic approach to recording these deformities and interpreting their meaning was groundbreaking. He meticulously documented each deformity he encountered, seeking patterns, correlating specific abnormalities with historical events, and developing a set of rules for understanding these correlations. Lancisi catalogued the deformities he saw in minute detail, noting the type of malformation, the age of the child, and the timing of their birth. Then, he would try to link these physical anomalies to significant events in the world: wars, earthquakes, famines, political revolutions, and plagues. The belief that there was an intricate connection between the body and the fate of nations, or even the course of history, was a reflection of the age's penchant for searching for meaning in the natural world. One example of Lancisi's method was his belief that certain physical deformities predicted earthquakes. In one of his most controversial observations, he suggested that children born with certain physical anomalies, such as a cleft palate or a malformed skull, could be seen as signs that an earthquake was imminent. Lancisi wasn't the only person in Naples at the time to draw such connections. Many people believed that the earth itself could send messages to humankind through omens and signs. This was particularly true in Naples, a city known for its seismic activity, situated as it was near the active volcano Mount Vesuvius. Earthquakes were a frequent threat, and the people of Naples were well aware of the devastation that such natural disasters could bring. In the context of this persistent fear, Lancisi's theory about deformities as precursors to natural catastrophes found an audience. The idea was unsettling. Children born with deformities were not simply the unlucky recipients of genetic misfortune, they were the bearers of warning signs, the living manifestations of something ominous on the horizon. Lancisi's theories, however, didn't just extend to earthquakes. He also believed that deformities were indicative of political or social change. For instance, certain types of deformities were, in Lancisi's mind, a harbinger of war or societal upheaval. His thinking was based on the belief that the human body was not an isolated entity but rather an interconnected part of a greater, divine order. He believed that deformities, like any other phenomena in nature, were governed by cosmic laws, laws that were not always apparent to the human eye but could be understood through careful observation and interpretation. The child born with a twisted limb or an abnormal skull, in Lancisi's eyes, was more than just a medical curiosity. They were living signals of a society on the brink of dramatic change. Lancisi didn't approach his observations in a haphazard or whimsical way. He approached them with a methodical rigor that mirrored the scientific practices of his time. He took copious notes and kept detailed records of every deformity he encountered, cataloguing them in relation to the events unfolding in the world around him. The result was a catalogue of deformities that attempted to trace the shape of human history through the physical form. This was not just a medical catalogue, it was a historical one as well. Lancisi's system was a way of mapping the intersection between the body and history, an effort to uncover hidden truths about the world through the study of its most vulnerable and most tragic members. But Lancisi's theories didn't sit well with everyone. Even in an era when superstition still had a strong hold over the collective imagination, his ideas were considered extreme by many of his peers. The medical community of the 18th century was beginning to embrace more rational, scientific approaches to the study of disease and human biology, and Lancisi's blending of science and mysticism was met with skepticism. His theories about deformities as Prophecies were seen by many as a dangerous distraction from the real work of medicine. To his critics, his methods were nothing more than a form of pseudoscience, an attempt to make sense of the unknown by imposing a false structure upon it. His work was criticized for its reliance on superstition and for its failure to adhere to the principles of scientific experimentation and empirical observation. Despite these criticisms, Lancisi's theories continued to influence medical and philosophical thought, particularly in the realm of genetics and the study of hereditary diseases. His work foreshadowed some of the later developments in the field of genetics, particularly the idea that physical anomalies could be connected to larger societal forces. Although Lancisi did not understand the biological mechanisms behind deformities in the way that modern science does, his cataloguing of physical anomalies as linked to historical events was an early attempt to identify patterns in human biology that went beyond individual cases. Lancisi's theories were not entirely abandoned by history. In the 19th century, as genetics and evolutionary biology gained traction, some of his ideas about the hereditary nature of deformities found a new resonance in the study of genetic disorders. While Lancisi's belief in deformities as Prophecies was ultimately proven to be a product of his time, his focus on documenting and categorizing anomalies was an important step in the history of medical research. He helped pave the way for future physicians to see the human body as a site of information, where patterns could be found and understood, even if they were not immediately obvious. Lancesis' work also reflects a larger intellectual struggle that was taking place during the 18th century. The Enlightenment was a time of great optimism about human reason and the potential for scientific progress, yet it was also a time when ancient beliefs and superstitions were not so easily dismissed. The medical world, like many other intellectual fields, was still deeply entangled with the old ways of thinking, and Lancesis' work is a testament to the tensions that existed between the growing acceptance of scientific rationalism and the enduring power of religious and mystical thought. His theories about deformities as Prophecies were an attempt to bridge these two worlds, to make sense of the strange, seemingly random world of physical anomalies in a way that aligned with the religious and philosophical beliefs of his time. In retrospect, Lancesis' ideas about deformities might seem naive, even preposterous. Yet they offer a fascinating window into the complexities of 18th century thought, where the boundaries between science and superstition were far from clear. Lancesis' work reflects the era's search for meaning in a world that often seemed chaotic and incomprehensible, and his efforts to understand the hidden forces behind human biology continue to resonate in the modern quest to decode the mysteries of genetics, evolution, and the human form. Giovanni Maria Lancesis' theories about deformities were not just a reflection of his personal medical practice or intellectual interests, they were indicative of the broader cultural and intellectual currents of 18th century Europe. His beliefs represented a fascinating intersection of medicine, religion, and philosophy, a fusion of the rational and the mystical that was not entirely unusual for the time. What makes Lancesis' work especially compelling, however, is the context in which it emerged. A time when Enlightenment thinking was beginning to challenge long-held superstitions, and when the power of reason was starting to redefine human understanding. Yet even as the Enlightenment promoted the idea that the natural world could be understood through observation and scientific inquiry, the deeply ingrained cultural beliefs about fate, divine intervention, and omens continued to shape the way people interpreted their world. At the heart of Lancesis' ideas was the belief that deformities were not just random medical anomalies or unfortunate accidents of nature. He believed that these physical irregularities were, in some way, connected to the larger forces at play in the world, forces that were often invisible, mysterious, and divine. Deformities, in Lancesis' mind, were like clues left by these unseen forces, a way for the universe or a higher power to communicate with humanity. This approach was not simply rooted in science, but in a worldview that was still profoundly influenced by religious ideas about the human body. At the time, many saw the body as a reflection of the soul, and any imperfection in the body was often interpreted as a reflection of spiritual turmoil or divine displeasure. The idea that deformities could be prophetic was, in this sense, a logical extension of the belief that the body was an outward manifestation of something greater, whether that was fate, divine will, or cosmic order. Lancesis was operating in a period of intellectual transition. The scientific revolution, which had begun in the previous century, was making great strides in fields such as astronomy, physics, and anatomy, and these advances were beginning to reshape the way people thought about the natural world. However, the scientific community was still in its infancy, and much of what we now take for granted in the study of genetics, biology, and medicine was still unknown. At the same time, Europe was still deeply influenced by its medieval and Renaissance roots, where ideas about divine intervention, prophecy, and supernatural forces were intertwined with everyday life. The coexistence of these two intellectual traditions, reason and superstition, science and mysticism, created a fertile ground for someone like Lancesis to propose his controversial ideas. In Lancesis' view, deformities were not simply biological or anatomical problems that needed to be fixed. They were not just the results of genetic errors or diseases. Instead, they were a form of communication from the cosmos, a manifestation of something beyond human understanding. For Lancesis, the human body was a kind of open book, a living record of divine intention or cosmic order. Deformities, he believed, were not the products of random chance, but were shaped by forces that went beyond mere biology. They were harbingers of future events, markers of some larger unfolding story. He saw them as symbols, signs that pointed toward a greater truth that could only be understood through careful observation and interpretation. What is fascinating about Lancesis' theories is not just his belief that deformities were prophetic, but how he sought to make sense of them. He was not content to merely catalogue these anomalies and leave them at that. He actively looked for patterns, correlations between the deformities he observed and the larger events of the world around him. Lancesis would carefully record the time, place, and nature of each deformity, and then attempt to correlate these with major historical events, wars, plagues, political upheavals, and natural disasters. In his mind, The appearance of a particular deformity in a child was not just an isolated medical incident, but a premonition, a warning sign that could point to something larger on the horizon. Lancesis' most well-known and most controversial theory was that deformities could predict natural disasters, particularly earthquakes. His belief in this connection was not without foundation, as Naples was a city constantly at risk of seismic activity due to its proximity to Mount Vesuvius, one of the most famous and dangerous volcanoes in the world. The people of Naples were well aware of the destructive power of earthquakes, and many believed that the earth itself could communicate through signs and omens. Lancesis, drawing on the prevailing superstitions of his time, theorized that children born with certain deformities, such as a cleft palate or a malformed skull, were signs that an earthquake was imminent. This was not merely an eccentric idea. It was grounded in the belief that the natural world was interconnected and that signs in one area, such as the human body, could signal changes or events in another, like a catastrophic shift in the Earth's crust. Lancesis was not alone in his belief that the body could act as a conduit for prophetic messages. During the 18th century, many people believed that physical deformities were linked to divine punishment, bad omens, or the wrath of God. Children born with deformities were often viewed with fear and suspicion, as they were thought to be the living embodiment of some cosmic disorder. Lancesis' perspective, however, was more complex. While he did not dismiss the idea of divine influence, he saw these deformities as part of a larger, natural order, a set of laws that govern not just the human body, but the entire universe. To Lancesis, deformities were not just punishments from a vengeful God, but rather signs of an intricate, divine system that could be understood by those who were willing to look closely enough. The question arises, why did Lancesis, a physician trained in the methods of observation and dissection, choose to pursue a theory that seems so outside the bounds of mainstream scientific thought? The answer lies in both his education and his environment. Lancesis was educated during a time when medicine was undergoing significant change, and the scientific method was beginning to take hold. Yet, his training was not completely divorced from the superstitions and religious beliefs that dominated much of 18th century Europe. The study of anatomy was still in its infancy, and many physicians relied on outdated theories, such as the four humors or the influence of the stars, to explain medical conditions. Lancesis' training was also influenced by the age-old belief that the human body was a vessel for the soul, a perspective that was deeply embedded in the religious and philosophical traditions of the time. In this sense, Lancesis' theories about deformities were a reflection of the intellectual and cultural environment in which he lived, a time when the human body was both a scientific puzzle and a divine symbol. Moreover, Lancesis' approach was part of a broader intellectual trend in the 18th century, where the boundaries between different fields of knowledge were less clearly defined than they are today. In an age when science was still heavily influenced by philosophy and religion, many intellectuals sought to reconcile empirical observation with spiritual beliefs. Lancesis, like others in his time, believed that the study of the human body could reveal not just biological truths, but also spiritual and cosmic ones. His work on deformities was, in part, an attempt to bridge the gap between the material and the metaphysical, to understand the hidden forces that he believed shaped both individual lives and the course of human history. Lancesis' work also highlights the importance of his time and place. Naples, as a city at the crossroads of scientific inquiry and religious devotion, was uniquely positioned to foster such ideas. Naples was home to a rich intellectual tradition, with scholars and physicians engaged in a wide range of medical and philosophical studies. But it was also a city steeped in religious and cultural traditions that influenced every aspect of life. It was not unusual for the people of Naples to seek out hidden meanings in the natural world, to see divine messages in the patterns of nature, or to believe that omens and prophecies could be found in the human form. Lancesis' theories about deformities as omens were a reflection of this cultural atmosphere, where medicine, mysticism, and religion often overlapped. It is also worth considering the broader implications of Lancesis' work. His theories about deformities as prophecies may seem strange or even absurd from a modern perspective, but they reflect a fundamental human desire to find meaning in the seemingly random and chaotic world around us. For Lancesis, as for many others in his time, the human body was a microcosm of the larger universe, and by studying the body, one could gain insights into the workings of fate, destiny, and divine will. In this sense, Lancesis' work was part of a larger intellectual movement that sought to impose order on a world that often seemed unpredictable and beyond human control. By interpreting deformities as signs of future events, Lancesis was attempting to make sense of the randomness of life and death, to find a pattern in the chaos of nature. In examining Lancesis' work today, it is important to recognize the context in which it was produced. While his theories about deformities as Prophecies may seem fantastical to modern sensibilities, they were a product of their time, a time when the lines between science, religion, and mysticism were far less defined than they are today. Lanceise's efforts to catalogue deformities as omens of future events can be seen as an early, albeit flawed, attempt to understand the complex relationship between the body and the larger forces at play in the world. His work reminds us that, even in the face of the Enlightenment's push for reason and scientific progress, human beings have always sought to find meaning in the mysteries of life, often blending the rational with the supernatural in ways that are difficult to separate. The legacy of Giovanni Maria Lancisi is a complex one, marked by his groundbreaking work on deformities and his attempt to bridge the gap between science, mysticism, and religious belief. Despite the passage of time and the scientific advancements that have followed, Lanceise's theories about deformities as Prophecies continue to resonate, if only as a symbol of the intellectual tensions that characterized the 18th century. His work provides a fascinating window into a period when the boundaries between science and superstition were fluid, and when the understanding of the human body was still deeply influenced by cultural and religious beliefs. At the heart of Lanceise's legacy is his attempt to draw meaning from the human body in a way that combined empirical observation with the metaphysical. His belief that deformities could serve as signs of future events was not rooted in the scientific methods that would later come to define modern medicine. Instead, it reflected the intellectual climate of his time, a time when the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and scientific discovery was just beginning to take hold, but when deep-seated religious and mystical beliefs still had a powerful influence on how people understood the world. Lanceise's cataloguing of deformities as omens was not an isolated incident in the history of medicine. Rather, it was a part of a broader intellectual trend in the 18th century, when medical practitioners and philosophers were grappling with the question of how to understand the body in relation to the larger forces of nature, society, and the divine. Many of Lanceise's contemporaries were trying to reconcile the growing body of scientific knowledge with the deeply ingrained belief in supernatural forces, divine will, and the power of fate. Lancise, however, was one of the few who openly attempted to blend these two worlds, offering a unique perspective on how the human body could be understood as a kind of living text, a vehicle for communicating deeper truths about the universe. In many ways, Lancise's work represented a turning point in the history of medicine. The 18th century was a time of great intellectual ferment, with scientific discoveries that would lay the groundwork for modern biology and genetics. Yet, it was also a time when the old paradigms of medical thought, deeply intertwined with religious and mystical beliefs, were difficult to shake off. Lanceise's theories about deformities as Prophecies were a reflection of the intellectual struggle that took place during this period, a struggle between the rise of empirical, evidence-based science and the enduring influence of spiritual and metaphysical ideas. It is this tension that makes Lanceise's legacy so compelling and so reflective of the intellectual climate of the time. One of the reasons that Lanceise's theories about deformities are so intriguing is that they touch on a much larger question. How do we understand the relationship between the human body and the larger forces that shape our lives? For Lancise, the body was not just a biological entity, but a reflection of the greater cosmic order. Deformities, in his view, were not random occurrences or signs of genetic misfortune, but symbolic messages that had the power to reveal hidden truths about the future. This view of the body as a conduit for divine or cosmic messages was common in many cultures throughout history, and it reflects the deep human desire to find meaning in the world around us. Whether through astrology, omens, or physical anomalies, people throughout history have sought to understand the invisible forces that seem to govern human existence, and Lancise's work can be seen as part of that broader quest for meaning. While Lancise's theories about deformities as Prophecies were ultimately rejected by the medical community of his time, his work had a lasting influence on the way that future generations would approach the study of the human body. His careful cataloguing of deformities, his attempts to find patterns in the seemingly random, foreshadowed the later development of genetics and the study of hereditary diseases. His focus on the physical body as a source of hidden information was a precursor to the more scientific approaches to understanding genetic disorders and birth defects. In this sense, Lancise's work was ahead of its time, attempting to establish a framework for understanding the relationship between physical abnormalities and larger societal events. Yet, despite the forward-looking nature of his work, Lancise's theories about deformities as Prophecies were deeply rooted in the intellectual traditions of his time. He was not the first to propose that deformities were linked to divine will or cosmic forces. Throughout history, physical anomalies have often been interpreted as signs of something greater, whether that was divine punishment, a reflection of moral failings, or a manifestation of supernatural power. In the 18th century, this belief was still widespread, particularly in religious contexts, where the human body was often seen as a reflection of the soul. Lancesis' theories about deformities as omens were in many ways an attempt to make sense of these ancient beliefs, to provide a more systematic framework for understanding the spiritual and metaphysical significance of physical abnormalities. It is important to recognize that Lancesis' ideas about deformities were not without their critics. Even during his lifetime, many in the medical community dismissed his work as pseudoscience. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and empirical evidence was beginning to take root, and many physicians and philosophers were increasingly skeptical of ideas that were not grounded in the scientific method. Lancesis' belief that deformities were prophetic, that they could predict future events, was seen by many as an illogical and unsubstantiated claim. To his critics, Lancesis' work was a dangerous diversion from the real work of medicine, an attempt to impose meaning on the random and chaotic nature of disease and genetics. However, even as his theories were rejected by the medical establishment, Lancesis' work continued to influence medical thought in less direct ways. His meticulous documentation of deformities, his careful observation of patterns in the human body, and his attempt to link these observations to broader societal events were all steps toward a more systematic approach to understanding human biology. While Lancesis' conclusions were not scientifically valid, his methods, the collection of detailed data, the search for patterns, and the attempt to correlate biological anomalies with external events, were consistent with the scientific practices that would come to define modern medicine. In many ways, Lancesis' theories about deformities as prophecies can be seen as an early attempt to merge science with philosophy and religion. He was not simply a physician, but a thinker who sought to understand the human condition in its fullest sense. His belief that deformities were signs of something greater, whether divine or cosmic, reflects the larger intellectual currents of the 18th century, a time when the boundaries between science, philosophy, and religion were not as rigidly defined as they are today. The influence of religion and mysticism on his work was undeniable, and it is this aspect of his legacy that sets him apart from many of his contemporaries. Despite the dismissal of his ideas by the medical community, Lancesis' work on deformities had a lasting impact on the way that future generations approached the study of human biology. His cataloguing of deformities, his efforts to find patterns in the physical world, and his attempts to correlate these patterns with larger historical events were all steps toward the development of modern medicine's more systematic, empirical approach to understanding the human body. While his theories about deformities as prophecies were ultimately proven to be incorrect, his methods of observation and documentation were influential in the development of the fields of genetics and embryology. Lancesis' legacy is not confined to his theories about deformities. He was also a physician and public health official, and his work in these areas had a lasting impact on the medical profession. As a physician, Lancesis was committed to improving public health and advancing the study of disease. He was particularly interested in the study of malaria and was one of the earliest proponents of the idea that malaria was transmitted by mosquitoes. His work in this area was groundbreaking, and it helped to lay the foundation for later developments in the study of infectious diseases. In this sense, Lancesis' legacy extends beyond his work on deformities and encompasses a broader commitment to improving the health of the population. Today, Lancesis' work is viewed with a mixture of admiration and skepticism. His theories about deformities as prophecies were clearly misguided, yet they were a reflection of the intellectual and cultural climate of the 18th century. His efforts to bridge the gap between science and mysticism were indicative of the broader struggles that were taking place during this time, a time when the boundaries between reason and belief were not as clearly defined as they are today. Lancesis' work on deformities may seem strange from a modern perspective, but it offers a valuable glimpse into the history of medicine and the ways in which intellectual currents have shaped our understanding of the human body. In the end, Lancesis' legacy is one of intellectual curiosity, scientific rigor, and an unwavering commitment to understanding the human body in all its complexities. While his conclusions about deformities as prophecies may have been misguided, his methods of observation and documentation set the stage for later developments in medicine and biology. Lancesis' work serves as a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge is often fraught with uncertainties, contradictions, and tensions, but it is through these struggles that we are able to deepen our understanding of the world around us. Even in his errors, Lancesis' legacy is a testament to the power of inquiry, the quest for meaning, and the willingness to explore the unknown. Giovanni Maria Lancesis' theories, particularly his belief that deformities could predict future events, have left a shadow on the landscape of medical history. Though widely dismissed as unscientific by later generations, His work serves as a reminder of how intellectual boundaries were defined during the Enlightenment. The marriage of superstition, religion, and burgeoning scientific thought during this period gave birth to ideas that would later seem implausible but were, at the time, genuinely attempting to answer the same fundamental questions that continue to captivate humanity. What is the meaning of the body? What is the connection between the physical and the metaphysical? What role do individuals and societies play in the greater tapestry of life? Lanceise's controversial blending of science with mysticism was not out of place in an era where the supernatural and the scientific coexisted in a delicate balance. This was a time when reason and faith were not necessarily seen as opposites. For many, the human body was still a reflection of divine creation, and physical abnormalities were considered either an omen or a sign of divine intervention. Disease, deformity, and death had long been viewed through the lens of religious interpretation, with the human form seen not just as a biological system but as a vessel of divine will. In this context, Lanceise's attempt to interpret deformities as prophetic signs reflected a worldview where the body was not just a machine to be studied, but a symbol to be understood. He believed that deformities weren't just the products of unfortunate genetics or disease. They were, in his view, coded messages, transmitting signs from a higher power. Despite the criticisms that Lancise faced from his peers in the medical field, who believed that his ideas about deformities being linked to omens and future events were both outlandish and unprovable, there was still a level of scientific curiosity embedded in his approach. His observations were not purely based on mysticism. His work was deeply rooted in a tradition of documentation, categorization, and a systematic attempt to bring order to chaos. Unlike many figures in his time who accepted supernatural explanations for anomalies without question, Lancise painstakingly catalogued the deformities he encountered. He made detailed records, tracking the specific types of deformities, their ages of occurrence, and the dates and times when they were observed. This was no random exercise in folklore. It was an effort to discern patterns, even if those patterns were more reflective of his cultural and religious biases than of any scientifically verifiable conclusions. In his belief system, deformities acted as premonitions, a form of communication from the divine realm that conveyed critical messages for humankind. In Lancise's world, a malformed limb or a cleft palate could be an ominous sign that a storm was brewing, whether that storm was a natural disaster, a political upheaval, or something more insidious like a war or plague. The very presence of these abnormalities was interpreted as a warning to the broader society, as if the body itself was speaking the language of destiny. The individuals born with such deformities were not seen as just unfortunate or tragic. They were, in Lancise's interpretation, the messengers of fate. Their physical forms were the written evidence of an unseen hand guiding history toward its next inevitable crisis. The fact that Lancise attempted to link deformities to such monumental events, wars, plagues, earthquakes, and more, speaks volumes about his understanding of the human condition. It's clear that, in his mind, the body wasn't merely a physical entity. It was inextricably connected to the world around it. Society, nature, the body, and fate all existed within a grand, cosmic order, and it was possible to read the signs of this order by studying the human form. This is where Lancise's work becomes particularly fascinating. It was more than an attempt to categorize deformities. He sought, through this cataloging, to unlock the mysteries of existence itself. To him, deformities were not simply malfunctions of biology. They were intricate, cryptic messages embedded in flesh, awaiting decipherment. However, Lancise's work had far-reaching implications beyond the understanding of deformities themselves. The very act of documenting and categorizing abnormalities was, in many ways, an early attempt at empirical observation, a precursor to later advancements in genetics and hereditary science. Although his conclusions about deformities as omens of future events have been debunked, his detailed records represent an early step in the scientific journey to understand human variation. What Lancise may have failed to grasp scientifically, he inadvertently set in motion through his meticulous observation. His work on deformities highlights a central tension in the history of medicine, the interplay between empirical evidence and interpretive frameworks that seek to explain the unexplainable. In his quest to understand deformities, Lancise was not alone. His work echoes the anxieties and hopes of an entire era. The 18th century was a time of transition, intellectual, cultural, and medical. It was a period marked by the struggle between old beliefs and new scientific discoveries, a time when traditional understandings of disease, life, and the universe were being increasingly challenged. For centuries, The body had been understood in terms of religious and philosophical frameworks that viewed its imperfections as either divine punishments or reflections of internal moral or spiritual failings. Lancisi, influenced by the Enlightenment ideals of reason and empirical observation, sought to understand the body in a new way, but his thinking was still deeply rooted in the traditions of his time. Lancisi's ideas about deformities were a product of this intellectual crossroads. On the one hand, he embraced the growing body of medical knowledge that had emerged from the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, attempting to bring order and understanding to physical abnormalities. On the other hand, he could not escape the influence of religious and metaphysical beliefs that were deeply ingrained in the culture of his time. His attempt to explain deformities as omens of future events was, in many ways, an effort to reconcile these two worldviews, the empirical and the divine, within the context of the human body. One of the most intriguing aspects of Lancisi's legacy is how his work reflects the intellectual climate of Naples, the city in which he lived and worked. Naples was a city caught between scientific and religious traditions, where the Enlightenment's promise of reason and progress had to contend with the enduring power of faith. The city's proximity to the active volcano Mount Vesuvius made the people of Naples particularly attuned to the idea that the natural world could communicate through signs. Earthquakes and eruptions were frequent, and the people of Naples were accustomed to interpreting these events as both natural phenomena and divine messages. In this context, Lancisi's work on deformities as omens of impending disaster made perfect sense to many at the time. His theories were not simply the product of one man's eccentricity. They were a reflection of the cultural and intellectual currents of the era, a moment when the human body was seen as a symbol of greater forces beyond human comprehension. In his attempts to understand the significance of deformities, Lancisi also tapped into a long-standing cultural belief in the idea of the wounded body. For centuries, the body had been seen as a vessel that could bear the marks of divine punishment or moral transgression. In ancient times, physical deformities were often associated with sin, punishment, or divine displeasure. In medieval Europe, deformities were frequently viewed through a theological lens, where they were interpreted as either signs of God's anger or as markers of spiritual corruption. Lancisi's theories, while far more systematic, still maintained this connection between the body and spiritual or divine forces. He was not alone in this view. Many intellectuals of his time still believed that the body could provide clues about the soul, and that physical abnormalities could be linked to larger, cosmic truths. Despite the eventual rejection of Lancisi's theories by the medical community, his work was far from a failure. The very fact that he meticulously catalogued deformities and sought to draw connections between these physical irregularities and larger societal events was groundbreaking. His work paved the way for later advances in genetics and the study of congenital disorders, even if his conclusions were flawed. He was one of the first to treat the human body not just as an isolated physical entity, but as part of a larger system, one that was interconnected with history, society, and the natural world. In many ways, Lancisi's approach foreshadowed the modern emphasis on patterns and correlations in medical research, where the study of physical anomalies can help uncover hidden truths about the body's genetic makeup, developmental processes, and relationship to the environment. Lancisi's work also serves as a reminder of the deeply human desire to find meaning in the unknown. In his time, the world was full of mysteries, disease, deformity, and the unexplained phenomena of nature, things that were beyond human comprehension. For many, the idea that deformities were not random but carried a hidden message from the divine or the cosmos was a way to make sense of these mysteries. Lancisi's work, though rooted in superstition and flawed reasoning, reflects the intellectual and emotional struggle to understand a world that often seemed chaotic and beyond human control.